Hey guys, welcome to The Last Hike. Today I'm going over what the Grand Canyon did to a woman who chose to hike its deadliest trail with her phone in hand rather than some water. Her own ignorance pulled her deep into the canyon, way farther than she ever planned, and what the brutal July heat did to her on that hike will make you rethink every step you ever take outside without water. It was the 9th of July 2018. And the South Kaibab trailhead on the Grand Canyon's south rim was already filling with hikers by 6 a.m. The South Kaibab Trail is one of the most spectacular and most dangerous day hiking routes in the national park system. Unlike the nearby Bright Angel Trail, South Kaibab has no water anywhere along its length. No pipe stations, no creek, nothing. It also has almost no shade. What makes the canyon so deceptive is that it is upside down compared to a mountain. On a mountain, the hard part comes first. You climb when you are fresh and descend when you are tired, and the summit is a natural turnaround that forces a decision. The canyon reverses all of that. The easy part, the descent, comes first, when you are fresh and the air is cool. The hard part, the climb, comes last, when you are tired, dehydrated, and the day has heated up. There is no summit to force a turnaround, just an endless invitation to go a little deeper. Everything about the experience is built almost perfectly, to lure people past the point they can safely return from. Rangers understand this. Most first-time visitors do not. The park lives with the consequences of that gap every summer. Rangers and volunteers patrol the upper sections of these trails, specifically to catch people heading down unprepared, turning back hikers who have too little water, too little time, or too little understanding of what the heat will do to them. They hand out warnings, they ask pointed questions, they have talked countless people out of a hike that would have hurt them. But they cannot be everywhere, and they cannot stop someone who looks fit, moves well, and gives every appearance of knowing exactly what they are doing. The people who slip through are very often the ones who least look like they need stopping. Renee Calloway was 38 years old and lived in Denver. She was a competitive amateur trail runner who had completed multiple ultramarathons, including 2 50-mile mountain races, and who routinely logged 15 to 20-mile training runs through the foothills and high country around the Front Range. She was lean, exceptionally fit, and accustomed to a body that did whatever she asked of it. Friends described her as someone who treated difficult terrain as a kind of conversation, something to engage with rather than fear. She had run high mountain trails in brutal cold and thin air. She had pushed through the kind of fatigue in races that sends most people to medical tents. Her fitness was not a hobby. It was central to who she was. She had spent 15 years building that capability. She ran 6 days a week. She tracked her heart rate, her sleep, her recovery. She had a coach for her race seasons and a circle of running friends who treated long suffering on a trail as a form of fun. In the world she lived in, the body was a tool you sharpened, and discomfort was just information you learned to push past. That worldview had served her well across hundreds of races and training runs in the mountains of Colorado, where the danger was altitude and cold and the occasional storm, all things she understood and respected. What she did not have was any real experience with heat. Denver summers are warm but dry and mild compared to the desert Southwest, and her training was done at altitude where temperatures stay moderate. She had never trained in genuine extreme heat, had never felt what 110 degrees does to a working body, and had no instinct for how fast and how completely heat can take a person apart. Her mental model of difficulty was built entirely around cold, altitude, distance, and fatigue, the dangers she knew. The desert had a different one waiting for her, and it was not on her radar at all. She was at the Grand Canyon for a short solo trip, a few days of driving and sightseeing between races. She had no major hike planned. The canyon was a stop, not a destination. I'll be honest, she wasn't careless, she was capable, but sometimes the canyon punishes capable far harder than it punishes careless. On the morning of July 9th, she drove to the canyon and rode the shuttle bus out to the South Kaibab trailhead, which sits on a stretch of road closed to private vehicles, intending to do something small. Her plan, as later reconstructed from her messages and the account of a person who saw her at the trailhead, was to walk down to the first overlook, a popular spot called Ooh-Ah Point that sits less than a mile down the trail, take in the view, take a few photos, and walk back up. A 40-minute outing at most. Something to stretch her legs and see the canyon up close before getting back in the car. The night before, she had texted a friend that she might do a quick sunrise walk at the canyon before driving on. Nothing serious, just to see it properly. That was the entire scope of the plan, in her own words. A quick walk. Nothing serious. For a woman who considered a 20-mile mountain run a normal Tuesday, a A stroll to a viewpoint less than a mile away did not register as an activity that required preparation of any kind. Because that was the plan, she brought nothing. No water, no pack, no food. She had her phone, sunglasses, and a light long-sleeve layer tied around her waist. She was dressed for a casual morning, not for the canyon. To her, bringing water for a 40-minute walk to a viewpoint would have seemed almost absurd, the same way you wouldn't fill a hydration pack to walk to your mailbox. The problem was that the Grand Canyon is not a neighborhood, and the trail she was about to step onto does not behave like a walk to a viewpoint, no matter how short the first stretch of it feels. I genuinely can't wrap my head around someone carrying a phone but no water into the Grand Canyon in July. A person at the trailhead thought they remembered her days later, when investigators were asking around. While most hikers nearby were adjusting loaded packs and hydration bladders, this woman, as they recalled it, had walked past the warning signs with nothing in her hands but a phone. Memory at a crowded trailhead is a fragile thing, and the account was never something anyone could fully confirm, but it fit the one detail that was not in question, that when she was found, there was no water container on her, or anywhere near her. Put together, the picture was of a woman who had walked into the canyon with nothing to drink, though exactly how that choice got made, no one would ever really know. The warning signs at the South Kaibab trailhead are not subtle. They show a graphic of a strong young person and state directly that people exactly like that die in the canyon from heat, that going down is optional, but coming up is mandatory, and that hikers should not attempt to go too far. Renee, by every account, walked past them without slowing down. They were written for someone else, someone less capable, someone who needed the warning. That was the assumption anyway. I've stood at trailheads like that at dawn. It's cool and breezy, and I promise your body has no idea what's actually coming. The early morning descent was effortless. For a trained ultra runner, walking downhill on a well-graded trail in cool morning air is barely exercise. Renee reached Ooh Ah Point in roughly 15 minutes. The view was extraordinary, the canyon opening up in layers of red and gold in the early light. She took her photos, and then, instead of turning around, she kept going. I've made this exact mistake on a fun downhill, telling myself just one more bend, and that instinct is the deadly one here. This is the part of the canyon that gets people, and it has nothing to do with fitness. The descent feels wonderful. Every step down reveals a new view, a deeper layer, a more dramatic perspective. The next landmark always feels close. There is a psychological pull to a descending trail that is genuinely hard to resist, a sense that the real reward is always just a little further down, around the next bend, past the next ridge. For someone whose entire life had trained her to keep going when her body felt good, the pull was almost irresistible. Her body felt good, better than good. Now this is the exact spot where I'd have grabbed her arm or something, because a sensible plan dies down here, one pretty view at a time. Renee continued down to Cedar Ridge, a flat saddle about 1.5 miles in and 1,100 feet down, a common turnaround point with a pit toilet but no water. She felt strong. She felt better than strong. She felt like she was barely working. Cedar Ridge is where a lot of sensible day hikers stop, take in the view, and head back up, and even that climb sends plenty of them back to the rim tired. Renee barely paused, so she kept going. The canyon changed character as she dropped. The vegetation thinned. The walls rose higher on either side, throwing the morning into sharp lines of light and shadow. The air, so pleasant at the rim, grew noticeably warmer with every few hundred feet of descent, the way it does when you walk down into a basin that traps heat. She was descending into a different climate entirely, one layer of rock at a time, and the cool morning she had started in was being left behind above her with every switchback. None of it felt alarming. It felt like progress, like the reward for going a little further, which is exactly how the canyon draws people down. The way I see it, every step down a canyon is like a loan, and South Kaibab collects the whole thing on the way back up. Below Cedar Ridge, the trail steepens and the exposure increases. Renee continued down to Skeleton Point, 3 miles in and about 2,000 feet below the rim. Skeleton Point is the spot where the trail offers its first full view of the Colorado River far below, and it is the absolute maximum that the Park Service suggests for a summer day hike, with heavy warnings even then. By the time she reached it, the sun had climbed well above the canyon walls, and the temperature was rising fast. It was approaching 9 a.m. The cool morning was gone. Skeleton Point is where the trail finally reveals the Colorado River, a thin green ribbon impossibly far below, and it is genuinely one of the great views in the American Southwest. It is also, for a summer day hiker, a finish line disguised as a waypoint. The park asks people to treat it as the absolute turnaround, and for good reason. Everything beyond it is steeper, hotter, and further from help. Renee stood at that view with 2,000 feet of climbing already banked beneath her, feeling strong enough to think the river itself might be reasonable. It was not reasonable. It was never reasonable. But nothing in her body was telling her that yet. She had now descended 2,000 feet on no water in steadily increasing heat, and she felt, by every internal signal her body was sending, completely fine. This is the trap precisely. A person of Renee's fitness could descend another 1,000 feet and still feel capable. Her cardiovascular system was so efficient and her pain tolerance so high that the early warnings most people feel, the heaviness, the thirst, the small voice that says turn around, either weren't registering yet or were easy to dismiss. Her body had spent 15 years learning to ignore exactly those signals. That training, which made her a great athlete, had effectively disabled the alarm system that the canyon was depending on to send her back. A normal hiker arrives at Skeleton Point already tired, already thirsty, already aware that the climb back is going to be miserable, and that awareness is protective. It makes them turn around. Renee arrived at Skeleton Point feeling fresh. And feeling fresh at the deepest point most people are willing to go is not a sign of safety. It is a sign that you have the capacity to get into far more trouble than the average person, and no internal brake to stop you. I want to just yell it at the screen. Feeling great that deep in a waterless canyon isn't safety, it's the danger just being set even more. Renee continued past Skeleton Point. Exactly how far she went is something investigators could only estimate from her photos and the handful of points where people thought they saw her, but the best reconstruction had her descending toward the area approaching the tip-off, roughly 4.5 miles in and around 3,000 feet below the rim. Somewhere in this stretch, the heat finally reached her. The temperature this far down by mid-morning was likely well above 100 degrees. She had been moving for close to 3 hours with no water, and the first real symptoms arrived. A headache, a dryness she couldn't ignore, the first flicker of doubt. She turned around because she might have thought that at that point, turning around meant she was safe, and I wish that were true, but this is the moment the real fight starts. The problem was that turning around at 3,000 feet down is not the solution it feels like. It is the beginning of the hardest and most dangerous part. She now had to climb 3,000 vertical feet in fully exposed terrain, in rapidly intensifying heat, with no water and a body that had already started its slide. To put that climb in perspective, 3,000 feet of vertical gain is comparable to climbing the stairs of a 200-story building, except the stairs are uneven rock, the air is over 100 degrees, the sun is directly overhead with no shade, and there is no water at the top of any flight. The ascent is where the canyon does its real work. Climbing is metabolically expensive, it generates enormous internal heat, and that heat has to be shed through sweat. Sweating requires water. Renee had none. Within the first few hundred feet of climbing, her pace, which had been so effortless going down, collapsed. She was stopping frequently, seeking the thin slivers of shade thrown by the occasional rock outcrop, her heart rate climbing, her head pounding. The same trail that had felt like a gift on the way down had become a furnace she had to fight through step by step. I can't stress this enough. You don't tough out a core temperature. No one has ever taught her that. You can't tough that kind of thing out. It's not possible. I can't stress this enough. You do not tough out a core temperature, and nobody had ever once taught her that. For the first time in maybe her entire athletic life, Renee was encountering a situation that effort could not solve. In a race, when things get hard, you dig deeper, you push, you summon the will to keep going, and that works because the limiting factor is usually your own discomfort tolerance. In the canyon, the limiting factor was water and core temperature, and no amount of will produces water or sheds heat. Her single greatest asset, the ability to push her body past where other people quit, was useless here. And worse than useless, because it kept her moving and generating heat when stopping might have bought her time. The deterioration was not dramatic from the outside, which is part of what makes heat illness so insidious. There was no single moment of collapse, just a steady erosion. Her steps got shorter, her rest stops got longer and closer together. The headache that had started as a dull pressure became something she could feel behind her eyes. She was sweating less than she should have been, which she might have read as relief if she had known anything about heat, when in fact it is one of the worst signs there is. Her body was running low on the water it needed to keep cooling itself, and it was starting to make hard decisions about where to send what little remained. She would climb a short stretch, then stop, hands on her knees, waiting for a heart rate that would not come down the way it always had. The shade she chased kept getting smaller and farther apart as the sun climbed higher, until there was barely any shade left at all. Her mouth had gone past thirst into something drier and more frightening. Her thinking, when she tried to plan, kept sliding off the task, the simple math of how far she had to go and how long it would take refusing to add up in her head. She was still moving, still pointed uphill, still doing the one thing her whole life had taught her to do, which was to keep going. It was the wrong thing, and there was no longer any part of her clear enough to know it. There is a specific cruelty to the way the inner canyon holds heat. The rock absorbs the sun all morning and then radiates it back, so that by the middle of the day, a hiker is being cooked from above by direct sun and from below and beside by stone that has turned into a kind of oven. Ground level temperatures on an exposed trail can run well above whatever the official forecast number says. For a body already low on water and fighting to cool itself, that extra load is enormous. Renee was climbing through the hottest hours of the day into the hottest part of the canyon, and every foot of elevation she gained was also a foot deeper into the conditions the rangers warn about most. The math of it was simple and merciless. She was making heat faster than she could shed it, she had no water to spend on cooling, and the rock around her was pouring still more heat into the equation. There was only one way that equation ever resolves, and the canyon was already solving it. Heat does not negotiate. It doesn't care in the slightest how many miles a person has run in their life. On a trail as busy as South Kaibab, plenty of people passed her that morning, and working out afterward who had actually seen her, and when, was never clean. The account investigators leaned on most came from a man who had been descending with his teenage son. Somewhere in the late morning, he said, he passed a woman sitting on a rock in a patch of shade, flushed and breathing hard. He asked if she was okay. She told him she was fine, just resting, that she'd gone further than she meant to. He offered her water, and as he remembered it, she hesitated, took a few swallows from his bottle, then waved off more, saying he'd need it and that she was almost back up anyway. If it was her, and the details fit, she was not almost back up. She was over 2,000 feet below the rim. He said she sounded normal, maybe a little embarrassed about having gone too far, the way a capable person sounds when they have slightly miscalculated and don't want to make it a thing. There was no slurring, no obvious confusion, nothing that screamed emergency. That is part of what makes these situations so hard for the people who cross paths with them. By the time someone is visibly, unmistakably in crisis from heat, they are often already past the point where a few swallows of water and good intentions can save them. Renee was in that in-between zone, where she still seemed like a fit adult who had simply overdone it, and she presented herself that way because in her own mind, that is exactly what was happening. It wrecks me that she waved off more water just to be polite here. A few swallows was never gonna save her. The man said he had no reason at the time to think she was in serious danger. He and his son continued down. He told investigators later that he thought about her for a long time afterward. The heat in the canyon kept climbing toward its midday peak, and Renee kept climbing into it. The symptoms she was now feeling marking the progression of heat exhaustion toward heat stroke, the most dangerous heat-related condition there is. Her body, unable to cool itself without water, was losing the fight to regulate its core temperature. The headache intensified. Nausea set in. Her coordination began to slip. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke exist on a continuum, and the line between them is where it becomes life-threatening. In heat exhaustion, the body is struggling but still managing, sweating heavily, the person weak and nauseated but mentally present. Heat stroke is when the cooling system fails entirely. The core temperature climbs past the point the body can tolerate, and as it does, the brain itself begins to be affected. Once core temperature passes roughly 104 degrees, organ damage begins, and the swelling that follows produces confusion, disorientation, and eventually unconsciousness. What honestly scares me about heat stroke is that it steals your judgment at the exact moment that you need every bit of it. As Renee's core temperature climbed, her ability to make rational decisions, to recognize how much trouble she was in, to ration her energy, or even think about calling for help was eroding. And her lifetime of pushing through discomfort, the exact trait that made her a successful ultra runner, was now telling her to keep going when keeping going was killing her. The internal voice that had carried her through 50-mile races, the one that said, "You can handle this, keep moving," was the worst possible advisor in this specific situation, and it was the loudest voice she had. And it genuinely stings how every gift that made her great at racing turned into a liability the second that heat hit her. This is the part that separates heat deaths from almost every other kind of trail accident. There was no fall, no broken bone, no sudden catastrophe she could react against. The thing killing Renee was invisible and internal, a number climbing inside her own body, and the only treatment was the one thing she did not have and could not reach. Shade slowed it down. Rest slowed it down. But without water, and without a way to truly cool her core, slowing it down only stretched out the time, it did not change the direction. By late morning, her phone showed no reliable signal in most of the inner canyon, and even if it had, the decline of advancing heat stroke makes a coherent call for help less and less likely. Every ranger I've read says the same thing. The one who dies out here aren't necessarily the weak, they're the strong who ignore the warnings. She climbed back up towards Skeleton Point through the late morning and into the worst heat of the day, slower and slower, gaining maybe 1,000 feet from her turnaround in conditions that were now brutal. Another pair of hikers thought they might have seen her later on, a woman off the side of the trail who did not seem to be moving much, though they could not be sure it was her and could not place the time beyond sometime before midday. They assumed, like everyone else, that she was just resting in the shade. The canyon was full of people resting in shade that morning. By the time anyone realized she was not resting, it was far too late. Somewhere just below Skeleton Point, Renee stopped for the last time. She moved off the trail into a thin band of shade beneath a rock outcrop, and there, alone, with no water and no way to cool down, and no signal to call for help, her body finished what the heat had started. The sweating had already stopped. The cooling system was already gone. Her core temperature had climbed past the point a body can survive. And in that sliver of shade, roughly 2,000 feet below the rim, Renee Calloway died. Still 1,000 feet, and several brutal hours short of the rim she had walked away from that morning, expecting to be back at by mid-morning. I want her remembered for this. She clawed 1,000 feet back uphill with no water before her body quit. That's not weakness. When she didn't turn up or answer her messages the next day, the friend she had texted about a sunrise walk grew worried and called the park. Her car was found in a lot near the rim, and once the scattered sightings were gathered up, searchers concentrated on South Kaibab and found her there. She had no water container on her or anywhere near her, and an autopsy by the medical examiner confirmed hyperthermia, no heart problem, and no hidden condition. Just a healthy and extremely fit 38-year-old woman killed by a walk she thought would take 40 minutes. Much of her last day had to be pieced together rather than known. From the photos, the few people who crossed her path, and the hard physical facts of where she lay, but the shape of what happened to her was never really in doubt. Renee came to the Grand Canyon as one of the fittest people on the trail that morning, and it changed nothing, because the canyon doesn't reward strength. It rewards respect, and nobody had ever taught her the difference. She walked down with no water because she was only going a little way, and then the canyon showed her one more view, and one more, until there was no version of the climb back her body could survive. She didn't die because she was weak. She died because she was strong in the one place on Earth where being strong was the most dangerous thing she could be.